In my early 20s, I worked as a substitute teacher to save up some money before going to the seminary. And back in those days, I was working out a lot. And just about every day that I subbed a middle school class, inevitably, one of the kids would always ask to arm wrestle me. I could predict it like clockwork. Every day towards the end of a class, a brave soul would come up and ask, "Can I arm wrestle you, Mr. P?" And what am I going to say? No, of course not. So the whole class would gather around, and one by one, kids would step up to arm wrestle Mr. P. And the kids would give it their all, of course, trying 100%. While I, of course, being much older and stronger, would only give about 15%, let's say, of my real strength. Sometimes I'd even let the kids win. But if they knew I was letting them win and they would complain that I wasn't trying hard enough, I would slowly and gently beat them. But I would never go 100%, of course. Because what would be the point of that? The real strength was simply too much for the kids. It wouldn't do them any good for me to overwhelm them and overpower them. So I always held back, yet still participated with them on their level. I watered down the arm wrestling in a way that worked for the kids. Each arm wrestling match was a different plan on my part to make it work for each kid according to their own strength. This is the way God works with us. He does not appear to us at His 100%. The fullness of God is simply too much for any of us to comprehend, too much for any of us to bear. In fact, they say that an ant has a better chance of knowing the thoughts of a person than a person does of knowing the thoughts and the ways of God. This, then, is what makes this feast day of the Transfiguration so amazing today. Today we see Christ at full power, at His 100%. On this day, Christ, for the first time, reveals His real self, His true divine nature, to three specific disciples, Peter, James, and John. Jesus takes the three of them up a mountain to pray. While they are up there, it says, He was transfigured before them, and His face shone like the sun, and His garments became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with Him. And as these mystifying events are happening, the disciples immediately begin to try to respond somehow, to show some sort of comprehension or appreciation, like kids eager to arm wrestle. Peter starts talking to Christ even though Christ is speaking with Moses and Elijah. And what happens? God interrupts Peter to give a message that lays out what is really important. This was a direct message from God to the three disciples, but it is just as much of a direct message to all of us today. Peter is trying to form a reaction to what is happening before him when God speaks. It says, Peter was still speaking when, lo, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to Him." So while the fullness of God is impossible to understand, His message to all of us is simple. Jesus Christ is His Son. And all we need to do is simply listen to Him, to follow Him, to seek Him in our lives, to live as examples of His love in the world. And after hearing God's message, it says the disciples fell on their faces and were filled with awe. For the first time, they fully realized who Jesus was. Jesus is God himself, and God chose to send him to us as a man because for us, this is the only way we would be able to comprehend God. And even still, each one of us comprehends him to our own understanding. There are those who have a more developed understanding of God, and those people likely become saints. There are those that have a basic understanding of God, and there are plenty who have no understanding of God. But just as the sun shines on everything in some way or another, the divine light of God, which Jesus radiates today, falls upon each person on earth, whether they comprehend it or not. When it comes to our faith, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel like we don't know enough. But to tell you the truth, none of us will ever know everything there is to know about God. That's just not how it works. But that is perfectly okay. Today we get a glimpse of the real God, and his message to us is simply that Jesus Christ is his Son, and he wants us to listen to him. And when we listen to him, he speaks to each one of us according to our own levels of comprehension, and we experience him in our lives the way we are meant to. Saint Dorotheus of Gaza was a monk who lived in the 500s, and he was known for giving spiritual advice in a very logical and understandable way. He focused his teachings on everyday life, and on the importance of listening to Christ. He says, "In the measure that we pay attention and take care to carry out what we hear, God will always enlighten us and make us understand his will." God is indeed very difficult to comprehend. But when we remember his message today and simply listen to Christ, we can be enlightened by the same divine light that Christ radiates today on the feast of his transfiguration. Amen.